In 1846, in the United States, during a time when life grew increasingly difficult, a group of pioneers known as the Donner Party set out for California. However, their journey would become one of the most infamous and harrowing expeditions in American history. So what really happened? Before we dive into the details, don't forget to subscribe to History AI Knowledge. Your support motivates us to bring you amazing historical stories. Now, let's get started. In the mid-19th century, Springfield, Illinois was still recovering from the economic downturn of 1837. Although the crisis had passed, its effects lingered, pushing many families to seek opportunities to rebuild their lives elsewhere. Springfield's agricultural success had led to rapid population growth, making fertile land increasingly expensive and harder to access. The local economy relied on crops like wheat and corn, but fluctuating prices made farmers' incomes unstable. With the mindset that land is wealth, many families sought to expand their farms, something that had become increasingly difficult in Springfield. By 1839, Illinois experienced a population boom, further straining the area's resources and job opportunities. As the United States expanded westward, the development of the Oregon Trail and California Trail offered hope to those looking to escape hardships in the East and Midwest. For many in Springfield, the promise of free land and new opportunities in the Western Territories was irresistible. These challenges and the allure of a better life drove the Donner Party to leave their home in search of a brighter future in the West. Little did they know, their tragedy was only just beginning. In the spring of 1846, a group led by George Donner, a respected 60-year-old wealthy farmer from Springfield, Illinois, set out on an ambitious journey westward. George, along with his younger brother Jacob, had a vision: to travel to California. They were joined by James Reed, a businessman and close friend of Donner, who organized the expedition. The group packed their belongings into massive covered wagons, known as prairie schooners, loaded with supplies for the journey ahead. Originally, they planned to follow the familiar and safer Oregon Trail, but they eventually opted for a shortcut, Hastings Cutoff, a route that was said to shorten their trip. At first, they seemed well prepared, perhaps thinking they'd only need about 30 people to explore the rugged path. But that number quickly grew as families, including children, women, and the elderly, joined the trek. This transformed the group into a much larger migration community than they had anticipated. Books, such as The Emigrants' Guide to Oregon and California by Lansford Hastings, described this easier route in great detail, convincing many that the Hastings Cutoff was a viable option. On May 12, 1846, the Donner Party left Springfield, Illinois. They had already missed the ideal start time for westward migration, typically in April, when the weather was warmer and the grass was tall enough to feed the oxen pulling the wagons. Starting late meant they were racing against time, knowing that heavy snow could block the mountain passes as early as November, making travel impossible. Within a week of leaving Springfield, they encountered their first obstacle: the Big Blue River in Kansas. Torrential rains had caused the river to swell, turning it into a dangerous barrier. The group decided to rest along the riverbank, where they spent several days building rafts to ferry themselves, their oxen, and their supplies across. The crossing was slow and treacherous. Along the way, some of their cattle strayed or drowned, adding to their setbacks and slowing their progress. The Donner Party's struggles began to mount as they spent too much time crossing the Big Blue River, losing precious supplies and livestock in the process. However, their challenges seemed destined from the start. They had departed later than most groups and had failed to adequately prepare at Independence, Missouri, one of the last major supply points before pioneers ventured into the untamed wilderness of the Oregon and California trails. At Independence, families typically stocked up on flour, dried meat, beans, salt, sugar, and other non-perishable foods, enough to last 4 to 6 months. But because of their late departure, many essential supplies were likely depleted by earlier wagon trains. To make matters worse, the Donner Party brought along unnecessary personal items and goods, which added to the weight of their wagons and left less room for vital provisions. After a grueling stretch of travel, the party reached Fort Laramie, often referred to as the Gateway to the West. Here, wagon trains prepared for the tougher terrain that lay ahead. It was also a hub where explorers and pioneers exchanged advice and warnings about the dangers on the trail. At Fort Laramie, the Donner Party received a dire warning from James Clyman, an experienced frontiersman. Clyman strongly advised them against taking the Hastings cutoff, urging them to stick to the traditional route. Ignoring his advice, the group decided to gamble on the shortcut, driven by their faith in Lansford Hastings' promises. Speaking of Lansford Hastings, he seemed more like a marketer than a seasoned trailblazer. To promote his new route, he sent a letter to the Donner and Reed families, warning that the Mexican government in California might not welcome migrants, and suggesting they travel in large groups for safety. In his letter, he highlighted the promise of a new and better route to California, which he called Hastings Cutoff. Hastings even promised to meet the Donner Party at Black's Fork to personally guide them. This assurance, particularly persuasive to James Reed, convinced the group to take the risk. But trouble was brewing. Just a week before the Donner Party reached Black's Fork, journalist Edwin Bryant had explored the beginning of Hastings Cutoff. What he discovered was far from the easy route Hastings had described. The trail was rough, unsuitable for large wagons, and particularly dangerous for a group that included many women and children. Bryant sent a letter warning the Donner Party about the challenges ahead, but somehow they never received it. On July 27th, the Donner Party arrived at Black's Fork, only to find that Hastings was not there as promised. Instead, he had already left, leading another group of 40 wagons from the Harlan Young Party. Hastings left behind vague instructions for those who followed, abandoning the Donner Party to figure things out on their own. After 4 days of rest and wagon repairs, the Donner Party resumed their journey, now 11 days behind the Harlan Young group. During this time, they hired a new driver and welcomed additional members into their party. Among them was John Baptiste Trudeau, a New Mexico native who claimed to have extensive knowledge of Native Americans and the terrain leading to California. After leaving Black's Fork, the Donner Party followed the Hastings Cutoff, a supposed shortcut that would soon turn into a nightmare. Their next challenge was crossing the Great Salt Lake Desert, one of the most dangerous stretches of their journey. Hastings had left behind rough notes that made the route seem promising, giving the travelers a false sense of hope. With high spirits, the Donner Party set out, believing they could cross the desert in just 2 days, as Hastings had claimed. But reality was much harsher. The desert was not 40 miles long, it stretched over 80 miles of merciless terrain. As the days dragged on, water supplies dwindled, livestock collapsed from exhaustion, and some panicked and ran off. Wagons got stuck in the treacherous salt flats, forcing families to abandon them. The most vulnerable, children, the elderly, and pregnant women, suffered the worst. Instead of 2 days, it took nearly 6 grueling days to escape the desert. The experience shattered morale and deepened divisions within the group, as doubts over past decisions, especially taking the Hastings Cutoff, turned into open conflict. As they followed the Humboldt River, the Donner Party encountered a group of Paiute natives. At first, the Paiutes traveled alongside them, and the pioneers assumed they were friendly. But soon, livestock started disappearing, and some members of the party even reported arrows striking their cattle and horses. By mid-October, tensions were at a breaking point, and the group decided to split up to speed up their progress. However, disaster struck when 2 wagons became entangled. In the chaos, John Snyder, overwhelmed with frustration, violently struck a team ox belonging to Milt Elliott, the hired driver of James Reed. When Reed tried to intervene, Snyder turned on him, striking him with the handle of his whip. Even Reed's wife was hit when she tried to stop the attack. In a moment of rage and self-defense, Reed drew a knife and fatally stabbed Snyder. That night, the remaining pioneers gathered to decide Reed's fate. Many argued for his execution, as Snyder was more popular among them. In the end, they reached a harsh compromise. Reed was banished from the group, forced to leave without weapons. His family, left behind, would have to rely on the kindness of others to survive. By the end of October, as the Donner Party reached the foot of the Sierra Nevada near Truckee Lake, a brutal snowstorm shattered their will to continue. The snow fell heavily, quickly covering the paths and passes through the Sierra Nevada, the final route out of the perilous region. The snow piled up to 10 feet, making the trail impassable. With no other choice, the Donner Party was forced to turn back and take shelter near Truckee Lake. The weather was too harsh to hunt for food, and their supplies were running out. In a last-ditch effort, they sent a small group known as the Forlorn Hope to search for help. Tragically, some of the group did not survive the extreme cold and exhaustion. As the last of their food supply ran out, panic set in. Moral collapse followed, as some members of the party were forced to resort to cannibalism to survive, starting with those who had already died. However, not everyone could bring themselves to commit such an act. Some would rather die of hunger than partake in this ultimate desperation. After James Reed, one of the original leaders of the Donner Party, was exiled for killing a member of the party in an internal conflict, he set out alone across the desert and mountains. By October 1846, Reed reached California safely, only to learn that the Donner Party had been trapped by a snowstorm in the Sierra Nevada. Without hesitation, Reed took immediate action to organize a rescue mission. However, his efforts were delayed by the California authorities, who were focused on the ongoing Mexican-American War. In February 1847, the first rescue party, led by William Eddy and William Foster, two members of the Forlorn Hope, a group that initially left the camp in search of help, began their search for the stranded Donner Party members. Over the next several months, multiple rescue teams were sent out, continuing through late April 1847. Thanks to Reed's efforts and those of the rescue teams, 48 out of 87 members of the Donner Party survived. Reed's family, including his wife and children, were among the survivors. The story of the Donner Party garnered intense attention, not only because of the tragedy they endured, but also because of the deep lessons on resilience and the moral boundaries people face when pushed to the brink of desperation.